Vítám vás na konferenci Připomínka a výzkum holokaustu Romů a Sintů v 21. století. V tomto úvodnom bloku budete počuť úvodné prejavy Jany Horvátovej, Pera Östeina Vatné, charge d'affaires norského veľvyslanectva, Freda Tajkona, romského aktivistu zo Švédska, predsedu organizácie Romany Glinda a na záver Andre Ráča za dokumentačné a kultúrne centrum nemeckých Sinti a Roma v Heidelbergu. Od toho budeme mať video, pretože sa bohužiaľ kvôli chorobe nakoniec nemohol zúčastniť. Po úvodných prejavoch si vypočujete prednášku Karoly Fings Znalosti a produkce znalostí v souvislosti s persekucí a vraždení Romů a Sintů v Evropě je kritický náhled. Tak já poprosím na podium paní ředitelku Janu Horvátovou.
Vážené dámy, vážení pánové, vzácní hosté, potomci přeživších. Dobrý den, Láčo Džives. Připomínka a výzkum holokaustu Romů a Sintů v 21. století. Dovolte mi, abych zahájila takto nazvanou dvoudenní mezinárodní konferenci Muzea romské kultury a jeho vznikající pobočky Lety u Písku, Památníku, holokaustu Romů a Sintů v Čechách. Jaká je geneze práce muzea na daném poli? Muzeum vzniklo na jaře roku 1991 na odkazu první romské organizace u nás, Svazu cikánů Romů, a dalších 15 let fungovalo jako nezisková organizace. Od roku 2005 je muzeum státní příspěvkovou organizací. Od počátku své existence mělo téma válečné genocidy našich Romů a Sintů jako jedno z podstatných témat své práce. Respektive se vznikem muzea jsme jen navázali na naši práci z 80. let a fakticky pokračovali ve sběru a záznamu vzpomínek romských pamětníků na dobu perzekuce v protektorátu a dále. Muzeum se zaměřovalo zejména na přeživší místně bližšího koncentračního tábora pro tzv. Cikány a cikánské míšence z Moravy, tedy na někdejší vězně protektorátního tzv. Cikánského tábora v Hodoníně u Kunštátu. Ale zaznamenávali jsme i další, kteří byli do koncentračního tábora Auschwitz-Birkenau uvězněni nic netuše přímo ze svobodného života. Za více než 30 let práce muzeum takto zaznamenalo na 7 desítek přímých přeživších. Z nich dnes už bohužel nikdo nežije. 13. května roku 1995 jsme při odhalení památníku Zdeňka Hůly v Letech u Písku právě v městě Písku pořádali seminář s mezinárodní účastí nazvaný Neznámý holokaust. Ve stejném roce, tedy v srpnu roku 1995, Muzeum romské kultury ve spolupráci s obcí Hodonín u Kunštátu uspořádali pietní připomínkovou akci obětí místního koncentráku, která založila dlouholetou tradici pietních aktů, v nichž muzeum pokračuje dodnes. V roce 1997 jsme při příležitosti stejné piety v Hodoníně u Kunštátu na Žalově, tedy na místě provizorního pohřebiště obětí, slavnostně odhalili nový památník z dílny sochaře Eduarda Oláha. A o rok později, v roce 1998, pak osadili pamětní desku na zeď hřbitova v sousedních Černovicích, kde byly oběti tábora pohřbívány do vypuknutí tyfové epidemie. Autorkou reliéfu s romskými a českými nápisy je nevidomá sochařka Božena Přikrylová. Muzeum romské kultury se vysoce angažovalo v možnosti vykoupení státem někdejšího areálu koncentračního tábora v Hodoníně u Kunštátu a tehdejšího rekreačního zařízení Žalov, které na tomto místě fungovalo. To se podařilo v závěru roku 2009. Ale teprve v roce 2018, dle vládního usnesení, byl celý areál tehdy s již vybudovanými a zrekonstruovanými stavbami budoucího památníku předán do správy Muzea romské kultury. To památník zpřístupnilo veřejnosti v roce 2019 a v roce 2021 zde zpřístupnilo také novou stálou expozici s názvem Tábor Hodonín u Kunštátu, průsečík tragických osudů 1940 až 1950, střední Evropa. Rok 2018 byl rokem velkých změn pro Muzeum romské kultury. Taktéž na základě vládního usnesení byla péče o Lety u Písku svěřena Muzeu romské kultury. A to zde do konce roku 2022 velmi úsporně zdemolovalo nežádoucí vepřín a dle vítězného návrhu Mezinárodní krajinářsko-architektonické soutěže, který byl vybrán ve svorné a velmi produktivní spolupráci muzea a zástupců přeživších vedených Čeňkem Růžičkou, zahájilo budování nového památníku. To však už s výraznou podporou fondu EHP a Norska a také českého státu. Památník s názvem Lety u Písku, památník holokaustu Romů a Sintů v Čechách, se 2 novými expozicemi vnitřní a vnější bychom rádi veřejnosti zpřístupnili do konce letošního dubna. V roce 2018 byl muzeu svěřen zřizovatelem, tedy Ministerstvem kultury, další velký úkol. S podporou norských fondů vybudovat své pražské pracoviště, Centrum Romů a Sintů, které má být v hlavním městě Praze prezentací romské kultury i pohnutých válečných osudů našich původních Romů a Sintů. V současné době byla z ekonomických důvodů přerušena finančně náročná rekonstrukce sídla centra, ale máme podporu zřizovatele i norské strany, takže věříme, že se do budoucna podaří chybějící finance najít a Centrum Romů a Sintů v Praze dobudovat. V rámci činnosti centra však byla už v roce 2022 zahájena a doposud trvá výstava romského výtvarného umění Pundra do Rom, otevřená cesta v Praze v letohrádku Kinských. A 15. dubna letošního roku budeme v Praze v Klamgalasově paláci otevírat výstavu vztahující se k Letskému koncentračnímu táboru. Výstava se bude jmenovat Příběhy přeživších. Začala jsem dnes svou řeč Příběhy přeživších a těmi také skončím. Postupně se muzeu daří plody své dokumentační práce na poli výzkumu holokaustu Romů a Sintů zpřístupňovat veřejnosti. Jde o cyklus nazvaný To jsou těžké vzpomínky. V roce 2002 muzeum vyrobilo 30-minutový stejnojmenný filmový dokument ve 3 jazykových mutacích. Ten seznamuje s průběhem válečné genocidy Romů a Sintů, je využíván ve školách k výuce, ale běží také ve stálé expozici našeho muzea v budově v Brně, v expozici nazvané Příběh Romů. V roce 2013 Muzeum romské kultury vydalo stejnojmenné CD, tedy s názvem To jsou těžké vzpomínky, s romskými písněmi na téma holokaustu. A v roce 2021 muzeum publikovalo 800stránkovou stejnojmennou knihu, která tematicky vybírá a komentuje výpovědi právě těch 70 romských svědků genocidy. Zatím byl publikován jen první svazek, který líčí děje na území protektorátu. Kolegyně historička Anna Míšková bude chystat druhý svazek, kdy se osudy perzekvovaných Romů posouvají mimo protektorát. A někteří z nás mají dnes možnost si knihu odvést i sebou. Je tady v předsálí, jenom poprosím evidovat jména a případně organizace a e-mailový kontakt, ale kniha je opravdu určena badatelům. Za těchto 33 let, co muzeum existuje, je to velké množství práce, které je za námi. Mnoho je ale ještě před námi. Dnešní konference nám jistě pomůže k ohlédnutí se, načerpání nových sil i k inspiraci do práce budoucí. A za to vám už nyní děkuji a přeji příjemný den.
Následující prejav predniesie Per Øystein Vatne, chargé d'affaires norského velvyslanectví. Prosím na pódium, please, if you could.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear friends. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to greet you on behalf of the Norwegian government, at this international conference on the Roma and Sinti Holocaust here in Písek. To Norway grants, inclusion and empowerment of minorities have been a key priority all over Europe since the very beginning in 2004. In the Czech Republic, we have been focusing on the Roma minority. Our main concern has been to ensure that the Romas will not be left behind in the impressive modernization of Czech society that we have seen in the last 3 decades. We have passed some huge milestones. The adoption of the law on inclusive education in 2016 is one of them. The project to establish a Roma and Sinti Holocaust memorial in nearby Lety, which this conference is a part of, is another milestone. In our opinion, the Lety memorial has a fundamental symbol effect. It demonstrates not only to the population of the Czech Republic, but to the whole of Europe, that the Romas and Sintis' suffering and history are a part of our own suffering and history. Although the Norwegian Roma minority is rather small, the Roma Holocaust also affected us. In 1934, 1 year after Adolf Hitler established his openly racist regime, 68 Norwegian Romas who were fleeing from Germany to Norway were rejected by our border guards. Most of them later perished in gas chambers in Auschwitz and other concentration camps. It took Norway over 70 years to come to terms with this tragedy. In 2015, our then Prime Minister Erna Solberg described our betrayal of the Roma refugees in 1934 as a dark chapter of Norwegian history. At the same time, Prime Minister Solberg extended an official apology to Norway's Roma minority for the way they were treated in the years leading to the Second World War and also in several decades following the war. Therefore, I'm very grateful that Norwegian grants had the opportunity to support the coming memorial in Lety. We perceive this project also as a memorial to our own Romas who perished in the Holocaust. This is our contribution to ensure that the women, children and men who were murdered in Lety will be commemorated with the respect they deserve. The opening of the memorial should also be our commitment to never more be indifferent to racism, xenophobia, and totalitarian ideologies. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to see that such a great number of researchers and experts are attending today's conference. This fills me with hope that we soon will pass another milestone, and that is to make the Roma and Sinti Holocaust a standard part of the curriculum in schools and all over Europe. Let me extend my big thanks to the Museum of Roma Culture and all others who have made this important conference a reality. Thank you also to all the researchers and experts who have come here to Písek. The insight and the knowledge you will share today and tomorrow is fundamental for a peaceful, democratic and inclusive future in Europe. I wish you all a fruitful conference. Thank you very much.
S nasledujúcim prejavom vystúpi Fred Tajkon, náš ctený host zo Švédska a predseda organizácie Romany Glinda.
I'm very grateful to be here, and I would like to start to speak a little bit Romanes for our Roma friends. Okay, thank you. Taven bachtale Romale taven sastiveste, shukal di kautumen, kaya kamaste na isivtumen kaya velampe galo baro geste bararas odivano pa Lety. Gado gesti jek geste po minisarasamente na bistras ke bud ridvori. Tavi rom mule ando duito lumiako marimos kaya mele rom akaras akana samudaripe. Of course, non-Roma didn't understand, but I think the message went through to the Roma who are here. Honored guests and participants on this conference, I am grateful to have been invited to participate in this very important conference. We will talk here about the invisibility and erased memory of the Roma Holocaust, Samudaripe, as we call it in Romanes. Above all, we will hear about what happened to the Roma in the Czech Republic, and especially what happened to the Roma in Lety concentration camp, a camp that the communists turned into a pig farm. I know how much you Roma activists here in the Czech Republic have been working for that place to become a place of remembrance, and now it has become so. Congratulations. I'm glad that the authorities have come to their senses and put an end of the stinking and degrading pig farm in a place where so many Roma were murdered. It is important to continue the research and searching for places not only in the Czech Republic, but through the whole Europe, where the Roma were mass murdered by the primarily Nazis, but also by the accomplices among the local population. It is time that we start the research on the Roma Samudaripe. There are still too many gaps in the research done on the Holocaust. There are still many unknown mass graves and extermination camps waiting to be discovered. There are not many universities in Europe that work with this type of research. There must be more of them. Many more. We also want that the Roma to be part of those researchers, and for us Roma to share the stories in the form of testimonies from the Second World War. This year marks 79 years since the Second World War ended, and there are many Roma survivors, and there are not many Roma survivors left who can tell us about what happened to them during the war, what horror they was forced to endure. Therefore, we must gather the children and grandchildren of survivors. They can tell us what their relatives have been told them, but many who survived the horror of the war could not bear or did not want to be reminded of what they have been getting through. Many of the survivors was ashamed to tell, and few who could still tell were usually unable to write down their own history. We in Sweden can hear from children and grandchildren, and even from great-grandchildren, that they had relatives who have been interned in various concentration camps. Most of those were immigrants from Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, and former Yugoslavia. And that is also one reason that we don't have testimonies from the Swedish Roma, because Sweden wasn't involved in the Second World War. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of increased research. Therefore, it was with a great joy that I welcomed the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance mandate that came out 2021, where they recommended all the member states to strengthen the possibility of increased research and visibility of the Roma Holocaust. The Roma in Sweden were not affected as the same way as in Nazi-occupied Europe. But I came very close to the Holocaust at young age, when the young Roma woman, Sofia, we call her Jofi, and her cousin Hanna came to Sweden with the white buses, 1945. Sofia became my aunt by marriage, because she married my uncle. There weren't many Roma who came to Sweden on the white buses, and those who did probably came with them because no one knew that there was Roma. Because in that time, Sweden had closed the possibility for Roma to get into the country from 1914, and they took away the law 1954. That's why no Roma came from other concentration camps in Sweden. One of the reasons was that. Over time, much falls in oblivion, even among many researchers, scientists, and historians, and not at least among the general public. We must continue to insist that the whole truth comes out about Samudaripe, because there are not many countries, I'm sorry to say, but there's not many countries who are interested to highlight the Roma Holocaust. And it takes very long time to be recognized as a victim of the Holocaust. My friends, I have some good news. A Holocaust museum has recently opened in Stockholm. The newly established Holocaust Museum believes that the research on the Roma Holocaust has been neglected, and they must therefore work for visibility and initiate increased researchers. So now the Roma in Stockholm, I'm from Stockholm, we are sitting together with a new museum. We are 8 Roma persons who are sitting there, and we are working very close to the museum. And I also want to thank you, Jana, for the invitation that I could come here and speak, and I will follow you to Brno, and we will have some more details to speak about. So thank you very much for me. Thank you.
Posledný úvodný prejav predniesie Andrej Ráč, ale vzhľadom na to, že sa pre chorobu ospravedlnil, tak ho budeme mať vo forme videa. Prejav bude v nemeckom jazyku Preklady nájdete založené v taškách, v brožúrach. Vysia vám zozadu na stoličke.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Anna Mirda, liebe Jana Horvathova, liebe Karoly Fings, sehr geehrter Herr Taikon, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich heute für das Dokumentations- und Kulturzentrum Deutsche Sinti und Roma sprechen kann, und ich überbringe Ihnen sehr herzliche Grüße von Romani Rose. Dass diese Konferenz und die Eröffnung der Gedenkstätte Lety stattfinden können, ist zuerst der Verdienst des tschechischen Komitees für die Entschädigung des Roma-Holocaust und der zahlreichen Roma-Organisationen. Daher möchte ich heute auch an Cenk Ruzička erinnern, der sich jahrelang für die Erinnerung an den Holocaust an unsere Minderheit und eine Gedenkstätte in Lety eingesetzt hat. Heute feiern wir den vorläufigen Abschluss eines 30-jährigen Kampfes, der auch von den wenigen tschechischen Roma getragen wurde, die die nationalsozialistischen Vernichtungslager überlebt hatten. Die deutsche Regierung hat als Rechtnachfolgerin des Dritten Reichs fast 40 Jahre gebraucht, um die Vernichtung der europäischen Sinti und Roma als Völkermord anzuerkennen. Bis zur Eröffnung eines nationalen Denkmals hat es noch einmal weitere 30 Jahre gedauert. Auch in der Tschechischen Republik wurde die Erinnerung an die Verfolgung unserer Minderheit über Jahrzehnte hinweg völlig ignoriert. Es mag nicht beabsichtigt gewesen sein, aber dass ein ehemaliges Zwangsarbeits- und Konzentrationslager unserer Minderheit, in dem mehr als 300 Roma starben und fast 1000 Menschen weiter verschleppt wurden, über lange Jahre hinweg ein industrieller Schweinebetrieb war, ist ein bitteres Symbol der verdrängten Auseinandersetzung mit der Vergangenheit. Daher ist es ein wichtiges Signal in der heutigen Zeit, die wieder von stärker werdenden Hass und Hetze geprägt ist, wenn die Politik unsere Erinnerungsarbeit, die auch zur Stärkung der Demokratie beiträgt, unterstützt. Bis heute ist der Holocaust an den Sinti und Roma in Europa schlecht erforscht. Daher ist es bahnbrechend, dass in der kommenden Woche in einer Online-Veranstaltung die Enzyklopädie des NS-Völkermords und Holocaust an den Sinti und Roma Europa vorgestellt wird. In diesem großen Werk hat ein internationales Projekt an der Forschungsstelle Antiziganismus der Universität Heidelberg unter der Leitung von der heute hier anwesenden Dr. Karoly Fings das historische Wissen zu dem Holocaust der Sinti und Roma Europas zusammengeführt. Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, das Dokumentations- und Kulturzentrum Deutsche Sinti und Roma hat immer betont, dass das Gedenken und Erinnern an den Holocaust an unsere Minderheit keine Form der Schuldübertragung auf heutige und kommende Generationen ist. Erinnern bedeutet aber Verantwortung zu übernehmen und das Vermächtnis der Opfer zu ehren. Vor allem in Deutschland haben wir als Gesellschaft eine besondere Aufgabe angesichts der Menschheitsverbrechen der Nazis in Europa. Mit dem neuen Gedenkstätte in Lety freuen wir uns über einen neuen Partner im europäischen Gedenkstättennetzwerk. Intensive Zusammenarbeit wird es zuallererst mit dem Museum für Roma-Kultur in Brünn, dem Austausch und Zentrums auf den spannenden Austausch und Ihre Vorträge. Herzlichen Dank.
Tak ospravedlňujem sa za mierne technické problémy. Následovať bude hlavná prednáška s názvom Znalosti a produkce znalostí v souvislosti s perzekucí a vraždením Romů a Sintů v Evropě, kritický náhled. Prednáška bude v anglickom jazyku a predniesie ju pani doktorka Karola Fings. Karola Fings je historička, od roku 2020 vede projekt encyklopédie nacistické genocidy Romů a Sintů v Európe, financovaný Spolkovým ministerstvem zahraničí. V výzkumném centru pro anticiganismus na katedře historie Univerzity v Heidelbergu. Tak, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody, dear Jana, dear Anna, I can see her, dear colleagues, dear participants. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. Oh, this is not very practical here. It's on battery now? No, okay. Sorry. And I was very happy to accept this invitation, although I'm really running a bit short of time at the moment. As you heard before, the Encyclopedia of the Nazi Genocide of Sinti and Roma will be launched next week. We are far from ready, but something will be seen, so it's still a lot to do. It's the same like in Lety. A lot of things happen. Nothing is really ready now, but it will be ready, we are all sure. And I think it's extremely important that we will have this memorial to the Holocaust of Roma and Sinti in Bohemia here, and that it will be open. It will be a milestone, I think we all agree, for the visibility of the crimes committed against Roma and Sinti. And it is such a hard one and such a very complex place, and we are all very much looking forward to it, to have another anchor point for memory, and we really have too little of these sites all over Europe. And I really, my heartfelt congratulations for all the struggle you had in decades here in Czech Republic, and that you managed to establish this place. My presentation is about knowledge and knowledge production, and I think that in the course of your work on the camp in Lety, you too have often been faced with these questions. What do we actually know? What sources can we rely on? How are the sources we have to be understood? Of whom else could we find out about? What do we want to tell here in this place? What is our narrative? How can we communicate knowledge about the historical events at this place? I would like to share a few thoughts on these questions with you today, because I have faced and continue to face similar questions. Besides me, also the authors, of course, who are working on the Encyclopedia of the Nazi Genocide of the Sinti and Roma in Europe. In order to measure the horizon of our knowledge and to be able to expand it, we must above all ask questions, but also question much of what is supposedly known. Oh, it started from its own, right? So that's problematic here. I would like to begin with a quote from a German language newspaper published in London in March 1943. And as I see, you already could see it and read it, but I will reread it again. Quote, Hitler condemned the Nazis in the countries he ruled and occupied to extermination with executions, mass sterilization, a ban on wandering and forced labor. Jews and Gypsies had long been placed on the same level in the so-called racial evaluation. No Gypsy remained alive in Serbia. In Croatia, Gypsies are completely outlawed. In Czechoslovakia and Austria, the Gypsies are now in penal camps where they starve to death more slowly or more quickly. End of quotation. This is by no means the only report on the genocide to be found in the publicly accessible press in those years in the 1940s, before the end of the war. In addition to public reports, there are also unpublished reports, for example, dossiers of ambassadors, like the one by the Swiss ambassador Weiss, who reported from Cologne in 1940 on the first family-by-family deportation. There were also reports that underground movements were smuggling, for example, to London. I would like to remind you of the famous report by Slamek, a Polish Jew who described the murder of Roma from Burgenland in the Kulmov extermination camp in detail. And we also know of reports that leaked out about the murders in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The newspaper article I have just quoted is based on the testimony of a Yugoslavian physician who fled to London and who seems to have been remarkably well informed. Who was this physician? We do not know. Were the responsible authorities aware of the reports they received? Were there any reactions? We do not know. It is therefore all the more important that this topic is now receiving an attention in the encyclopedia for the first time, namely in articles written by Yves Rosenheft on the United Kingdom and Stefan Lederich on Switzerland. When I saw this article from March 1943 for the first time, I was astonished, not only about what was reported, not just about when it was reported. I asked myself why this knowledge had not found its way into public and academic discourse, why it had no impact after 1945, why the murder of the European Jew, Roma and Sinti was not worth more than a few quickly forgotten newspaper notes. Of course, we know many answers to this question today. After the end of the Second World War, so maybe you can find out how to fix it. I think there is an... No, I have to do it.
The timing should now.
Yes, great. Thanks a lot. After the end of the Second World War, most of the perpetrators were able to continue living as before, quite unlike the surviving Roma and Sinti. Here I'm talking primarily about the perpetrators from and in Germany. They made careers, had a good income, and largely escaped legal punishment for their crimes. Not least the so-called Iron Curtain protected many perpetrators. Most of the sites of the mass murders were in Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. The perpetrators from the Reich Security Main Office, the SS, the police and the Wehrmacht, they benefited from the so-called anti-fascist protective wall and the knowledge that may still have existed at the crime scenes because it did not reach the West. The sites of the crimes were converted, remodeled, buildings demolished, and land leveled. As a result, many architectural testimonies to the crimes disappeared. Another protection that the perpetrators could rely on was the anti-Gypsyism or the racism against Roma that continued to prevail after 1945. Sinti and Roma, pushed further to the margins of society, were not listened to. Despite many early testimonies by individuals and efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice and to investigate the crimes, their voices carried no weight and were marginalized. The effect was that the perpetrators dominated the narrative, saying there were no racial reasons. It was because Sinti and Roma were socials. And criminals, and that's why they had been deported. And I think that this way of turning around guilt and blaming the victims for the murder itself was a strategy that had a very long-lasting effect also on the history about the genocide of Sinti and Roma, and of course what they always know, it's moving. What they always achieved was that the genocide was not acknowledged and that compensation was not paid for years to Roma and Sinti. So unfortunately, I can't read Czech, so I'm not able to fix it here. But there is some time layer in there. Yeah. But automaticky, what's this here?
That's just the choice of the monitor.
Ah, okay. Mm-hmm. We try it again.
Yeah, we try again.
We try again. So, yes, somewhere, no back, somewhere there. No, sure. So where have you been? Yes, the perpetrators. Yes, and they prevented the acknowledgement of the genocide, and of course they prevented compensation, and they dominated the narrative, not only in society, but also very long in history. It was only with the civil rights movement, and Fred Taikon and Jana, they are symbols for this, that this gradually changed, this narrative. And since the 1990s, there has also been a quantitative and qualitative development in historical research, although the gaps still prevail, and we are really not very well established in that field. I think I can already say that the work on the encyclopedia has created an important new forum for academic exchange, which we urgently need across all borders, the exchange of information between the now more than 90 authors from 25 countries about literature, about sources, or, for example, about perpetrators who worked in Germany and in the Protectorate. We have exchanged here in our working group, I will come back to it later, is generating a great deal of new knowledge, and as Fred Taikon stressed before, we really need more research. Our knowledge is based on sources, and when we look at written sources from archives, it is sources like this, what we see here. This is the implementing regulation on the Minister of the Interior of the German Reich on the infamous Nuremberg laws. You see the quotation of the relevant passage here. Quotation, apart from the Jews, only the Gypsies regularly belonged to the alien races in Europe, end of quotation. An overwhelming number of the sources come from the perspective of the perpetrators who set the racist persecution in motion through laws, decrees, and edicts. The sources come from the perspective of officials and employees in the administration who thought they had to fight an alleged so-called gypsy plague. From the perspective of citizens who wanted to improve their own status by belittling others. And they come from the perspective of the murderers who killed hundreds of people a day and who, after 1945, were able to evade all responsibility with far too much success by lying and cheating. And as I said before, this discourse or narrative is still quite dominant in a lot of literature. And one of the work we have to do, we all have to do, be it in education, be it on memorial sites, be it in academia, is to think about this burden, to rename, to rewrite, and to rethink, as one project, I think it was ERIAC, is named. Rename, rewrite, rethink, also these narratives. And when working on, for example, the encyclopedia, we always have a lot of discussions when it comes to terms. Which terms can we use For example, the term Zigeunerlager, gypsy camp. How do we contextualize it? How can we name here what happened? How really can we be respectful with the victims, and to what extent do we have to quote these Nazi jargon, this perpetrators' jargon? Let us now listen to another very rare voice. It's the voice of Franz Horvath from Burgenland. I hope it works. In Austria, although spoken by a professional speaker in 2018. This is a letter from 12th May 1938 he wrote together with other Roma as a protest to the Reich government, and here they complained about the treatment by the notorious Gauleiter and governor of Burgenland, the SA-man Tobias Porci. So we try. Yes.
For us. But now we have to face a new suffering.
Okay. So we start again.
That has been inflicted on us recently.
Okay.
Franz Horvath. To the Reich government. Up until today, things have been very, very difficult for us. But now we have to face a new suffering that has been inflicted on us recently. The beginning of this new suffering reaches far back in the past and was set in motion against us last year, led by Dr. Tobias Porci, the new governor of Burgenland. Those affected are we Roma, the poorest people in the province. The following actions are being taken against us. All civil rights and entitlements for support or the legal process have been completely revoked. I have read, for example, in the Grenzmarkt Zeitung, published by Dr. Porci, that we are not entitled to vote, and we are not permitted to join the NSDAP. We are also not allowed to greet others with Heil Hitler and wear swastikas. Many men from amongst us Roma were in the Great War and fought for our fatherland just as bravely as others. But Dr. Porci has failed to acknowledge this. He speaks and writes that the gypsies shouldn't be given anything, no work, and we shouldn't be entitled to anything else. That's why I have spontaneously decided to contact the Supreme Reich government. The police have also been called in against us, and in speech and words, we are not being treated as is set out in law. We are often treated roughly because people are stirred up. Dr. Porci has deprived us of all civil rights without having a single reason to do so. With this agitation, Dr. Porci wants to earn a gold watch, although in reality, it's all a fairy tale. All this agitation arouses suspicions. Many amongst us are extremely angry and unhappy, because everywhere you go, all you hear is people saying, you'll have your hair cut and be sent to Abyssinia and become farmers there, and wild animals will devour you. That is what one gets to hear in government departments, and you're waved away with such stupidities. And then they all break out into fits of laughter. No help is given. We ask that the Supreme Reich government acknowledge our request and makes an effort to help us out of this distressful and miserable situation.
This letter was from 1938, and writing this letter did not go unpunished. Franz Horvath was deported to Dachau concentration camp in June 1938. There he was apparently considered a special prisoner, as he was severely mistreated by the SS from the outside. placed in solitary confinement, and finally transferred to a prison. He died on 22nd August 1938, 2 months after he had been deported. His story is told in the text on Dachau concentration camp in the encyclopedia. This early source is very remarkable because the consequences
Franz Horvath.
Oh,
To the Reich government.
sorry.
Up until
Because the consequences of racist agitation and the restriction of civil rights and the atmosphere and the whole society in the 1930s for daily life of the people becomes very clear here. Unfortunately, there are far too few such sources. As curator of the Voices of the Victims project, which is part of Rom Archive, the digital archive of Roma and Sinti in Europe, I was able to make these and a few other sources from the perspective of the persecuted, dating from the time of the persecution or immediately afterwards, accessible. And this was also the first time that we collaborated together with the museum in Brno. Jana, you also contributed to this. This brings us to the next genre of sources that is in contrast to the sources of the perpetrators and that are absolutely necessary to break through the perpetrator perspective, the testimonies of survivors. More attention has been paid to these since the 1990s, and I know that the Museum of Brno made a lot of efforts in order to collect such testimonies. However, interviews with survivors were conducted in general far too late, and it is often too difficult to track them down. And a lighthouse in this context, I think, is this webpage, Testimonies of Roma and Sinti, which is organized by the Prague Forum for Romani Histories, and whose website you can see here, of course. They have to rely on the collections of others. I think it would be very important if there were such outstanding initiatives in all European countries. Within the encyclopedia, we try to describe the most important holdings of such testimonies. For example, there will be an article about Yad Vashem and the interviews they took in the last years, or about the holdings of the Visual History Archive, and especially what they kind of interviews, which numbers, when were they taken, and in which countries do they have from Roma, and so on. But I think this is far, far from being enough. And also I think that it's very important to be aware that we have to be sensitive with these interviews while using the information, and to be aware of that there are a lot of things that are said, but also a lot of things that are not said. And there are also a lot of ethic challenges when we work with such interviews, for example, when it comes to specific forms of violence and mistreatment. But let's go back to the question of how we can generate knowledge and make it accessible. The encyclopedia will, of course, contain hundreds of texts that can be sorted from A to Z. But it was important to me that you don't just click through an alphabet and read a lot of texts. Therefore, we created structured access points to the processed knowledge. And one of these access points are these rubrics, so you can sort all the information after these rubrics. You can find, these are some large clusters of knowledge that can be targeted directly. For example, here the spaces, countries, regions, and places, what happened in which country and in which place. The crime scenes are of particular importance, the internments, camps, ghettos, and murder sites. Where exactly did the crimes take place? It was also mentioned several times this morning that the crime scenes are very important. The persecution system, institutions, persons, concepts, laws. Who were the people against, who were the people who took out this persecution? How was the persecution initiated and organized? Which institutions, which persons were responsible and were involved. Life paths of Sinti and Roma, who were the people against whom these crimes were committed, and how did they deal with the persecution and the experience of loss, violence, and dehumanization. We ask here, how have these people been killed? But to quote a colleague, Vola Bartash, who is here, she always stresses the aspect that we have to ask, how did these people manage to survive? And of course, the aftermath plays a role, what happened after 1945. Now let's take a look at the map of Europe from 1942. The encyclopedia attempts to depict events in 46 countries. We can say at least something about around 33 of them, but we know nothing about 13 countries like Andorra or Cyprus. We have no information. Of course, we cover not only the countries where the genocide took place in means by murder, we also cover countries like UK, I said before, because all country has something to do with the Second World War, and there are always stories to tell. And as part of the work on the encyclopedia, we have formed 18 working groups on different countries or regions, in which several authors and the encyclopedia team discuss the topics that have to be worked on, and then the texts that have to be written. And I think that this discourse is very stimulating, if sometimes exhausting, of course, but I think that all the effort will be worth it. It is also a great benefit for me personally to be in dialogue with so many authors. Well, what has to be stressed again is we have no stable scientific community working constantly in that field. This is one of the problems. We have projects, we have individuals. Most of the colleagues I work with here in the encyclopedia, they have no professorship. They have no position where they can continuously do research on this topic. They do it in the evening, they do it at the weekend, they do it in their holidays. And so therefore it's really a very, it's somehow maybe it's also a symbol of the status of this genocide when we see how weakly it is represented in academia. Well, it changed a little bit in the last years, but still we have here a lot of problems. And the vision to have in each country really stable research, permanent research, and sustainable research on that, also in reflection of the problematic racist knowledge we have in academia, and also being inclusive and having in mind that we want the Romani perspective in research, so that we have to support scientists with Romani background. I think this all has to be thought about too. Well, and here for the former Czechoslovakia, I work together with Aleta Beck, Matej Beranek, Monika Stachova, and Michal Schuster. He's here. And I think this is very enriching and important to have exchange because, for example, in Germany, I know some sources that are relevant for here, the Czech Republic. On the other hand, I get to know about a lot of persecution processes I didn't know before, and we can really try to make all this knowledge accessible. I think that the spatial localization of the crimes is very important for understanding the European dimension of the genocide. Maps are therefore another way of accessing the knowledge that we are currently processing and making available. There will be several maps, each with a specific focus. Here you can see an overview of the detention camps, or the so-called gypsy camps in the so-called German Reich, where you find the occupied protectorate, former Czech lands, and Austria, of course, integrated in the German Reich. Since the mid-1930s, camps intended only for Sinti and Roma had been established in Germany, and I always compare these kind of camps with the so-called ghetto houses that had been established in German cities to intern the Jews. And these camps in annexed Austria and in German-occupied Bohemia and Moravia were only established after the beginning of the Second World War. They were characterized by the fact that they were administered more centrally than the camps in the Old Reich, that they were larger in terms of the number of internees, and that a rigid camp regime prevailed from the outset. Each detention camp shown on the map will be covered step by step in the encyclopedia, and perhaps when everything is finished, we will be able to see much better what the similarities and what the differences were. Maps also make it easier to understand what persecution was like in countries we know little about. I created this map about persecution in fascist Italy using the lemmas written by the author Paola Trevisan. This helped me to understand what happened there. Sinti and Roma were subjected to various persecution measures. Most were interned in localities, in concentration camps, or penal colonies, or sent into banishment. Moreover, the theater of events is extremely complicated in Italy due to the German and Italian occupied Yugoslavian territories and the changed balance of power after the fall of Mussolini. I think that such maps will also significantly expand the body of knowledge that we have in the still small circle of researchers or interested persons in this field. In addition to the thematic maps, a lot of things going on here. In addition to the thematic maps, there's a dynamic map that can be zoomed. This map is a work in progress. The crime scenes covered in the lemmas are all recorded here. We are still at a relatively early stage, as you can see. Many detention camps and also concentration camps have already been entered, but by no means all. Above that, hundreds of massacre sites are still missing. We have started with the representation of the massacre sites in one part of German-occupied Poland, the general government. Here we have about 180 sites of mass murder. You can see the red points there. Oh, sorry. Leave it like it is. Well, we will add the other sites of massacres for 140 sites in German-occupied Ukraine, many other sites in German-occupied Russia, a lot of sites in the Baltic states, and so on. So this map will grow, and in the end we will have, I think, at least 400, 500, maybe more sites. I do not yet know. So, and on this map, if you go on this map, ooh, what did I do? Okay, so thank you. It's fine, this is the next, yes. And then if you go with the cursor on the map, you can go to each individual point and then find the name of this place and then click and you go directly to the lemma. I think that nobody will read all the approximately 1,000 texts we once will have in the encyclopedia, and even if they are read, it is difficult to link the information to each other. In order to visualize the events associated with the persecution, well, the decrees, deportations, the shootings, from a pan-European perspective, the events are brought together from dilemmas in a chronology. This makes it possible to grasp the events day by day, month per month. I think this will create a really rather a basic knowledge one needs to have or could have. And then when you click on the date, you get the list of lemmas where this incident plays a role. What has to be said when we're talking about knowledge and things we do not know, what we found out while compiling this chronology, and it's also a work in progress, it grows and grows, is that also we have not very reliable information on the transports, for example, coming to Auschwitz-Birkenau and going out of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I think this is one thing that bothered me most for years now already, that we have no solid research on Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this, although we have now the 80th anniversary of the murder of the last Sinti and Roma who had been imprisoned in the camp. And I think this gap is so significant, and we have to do all what we can to fill this gap and to find out more here. This is just another example, but I want to stress here another specific thing when it comes to the chronology: say their names. It is important to us that the people who were affected by persecution are also visible, also in this chronology, not always Himmler or Adolf Hitler, but the people that had been affected. And here is an example about how we process this knowledge. We integrate incidents and name people. For example, here on the 10th of February 1942, 46 inmates of the Niederhagen-Wewelsburg concentration camp, including the Sinti Felix Adler, Hermann Broschinski, Franz Lurski, Paul Morgenstern, and Janko Weiss, are deported to an unknown killing center and murdered as part of Aktion 14F13. This was in the frame of the so-called euthanasia. Or the other incident here, 17th of April 1942, in German-occupied Estonia, Tarzan Kozlowski and Robert Mitrovsky escaped from Harko prison. Robert Mitrovsky dies in a mass killing on 27th October 1942. All traces of Tarzan Kozlowski are lost after the escape. So this is the possibility to integrate the names of the people affected by persecution. So I have to look on the way of time. I have just introduced the rubrics before, and one of them is called Life Path, and I would like to give 3 examples. The encyclopedia will contain around 150 biographies in order to show the individuality of the victims, the diversity of their experiences, and if they survived, not only how they survived, but how they lived in the period after 1945. Many of these biographies are complex, often leading to several camps and several countries. These are cross-border experiences. So if we describe in the encyclopedia country by country what happened there, in these biographies you see that the persecution is for one person not only restricted on one country, if you look at all the deportations, the flights, and so on. Well, so the preparation is really essential, and in general, the preparation of biographies is used a lot and widely practiced in the communication of the genocide, about the genocide. We use this in schools, we use this in educational programs, and of course we always use it in memorial site. However, everyone involved knows how difficult it is to prepare these biographies. This photo here shows a sculpture dedicated to Haria Emeri Mihajlic. Mrs. Mihajlic was a Roma from Kosovo and saved a Jewish child during the German occupation. For this, she was honored by Yad Vashem as Writers Among the Nations on 21st August 1991. Haria Emeri Mihajlovic is today an icon in the communities, and of course, she will also be represented in the encyclopedia. What is striking, however, is that despite of her fame today, there are no reliable facts about her and her life. To this day, no research has been carried out into where she was born and when, nor is it known when she died. Like so many people who achieved incredible things during the years of persecution, she was forgotten after 1945 and only received attention after her death. And here also one specific aspect of knowledge is addressed. When we always say her place of birth is not known, her place of death is not known, of course we do not know it, but there are people who know it. Relatives know it. People in the village where she used to live might know it. The community members in this region, they might know it. But no one of us goes there and asks. And it's so, I think this is also, I found it in a lot of biographies that this is not really well done. And I think we have to improve this. We see here the hunger strike by survivors on the grounds of the Dachau concentration camp memorial site in Germany in April 1980. From the 4th to the 11th April, 12 Sinti and a social worker from Munich went on a hunger strike to protest against the continued discrimination against Sinti and Roma in the Federal Republic of Germany. 4 survivors took part in the hunger strike on the site of the former concentration camp, despite serious health risks for them. We see on the photograph Franz Wirbel on the left, survivor of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp, Hans Braun in the center, also a survivor of Auschwitz and concentration camp Flossenbürg, Jakob Bamberger on the right, survivor of Flossenbürg, Dachau and Buchenwald. The hunger strike attracted a great deal of media attention worldwide and suddenly brought the hitherto barely recognized persecution during National Socialism into the public eye. Hans Braun, in the middle, achieved a certain degree of fame as a result of the hunger strike, but his biography has only been now analyzed for the encyclopedia. His parents and his 10 siblings were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Only one sister survived among he and his sister. All others were murdered. He himself fled 7 times, shortly before imminent arrest or even after arrest. He went into hiding for a long time with the help of a Sinti network in Luxembourg, but was ultimately seized and deported to Auschwitz. I think knowing his life story gives you a different perspective on this photo and on the commitment and life's work of this survivor. It is important to me that we also tell the stories of lesser-known people, like the story of Christine Lehmann and her children Egon, Karl on the left, and Robert Georg on the right. Due to the Nuremberg laws, Christine Lehmann was forbidden to marry the children's father. They gave birth to a first child, and the police forbade them to live together. But of course, they were a pair and they wanted to stay together. Then, when it was clear that there's will be a second birth, Christine Lehmann fled to Luxembourg in this case too. Tried to find help there with relatives, And she gave birth to her youngest child in Luxembourg. And they left this child there, hoping to save them. Then she went back to Germany to the other child, and the police grabbed her and deported her to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then in February 1944, the police came from Duisburg to Luxembourg and picked the youngest child and also the older brother, and both children were deported to Auschwitz and did not survive. This photograph is the last testimony of mother and sons. It was sent to a relative in September 1942 and bears the inscription, "Take good care of the two Jave children in Romanes." Photographs will provide further access to knowledge. To this end, there is a photo archive entitled Perspectives on the Genocide in the Encyclopedia, maybe around 300 photographs we are going to publish. But we pay particular importance to the careful selection of these photographs. Photographs, especially from the time of National Socialism, and from the perspective of the majority society, are problematic sources because they often degrade the victims and give a false impression of the reality of life. Moreover, they conceal the actual relations of power. And in addition, the impact of photographs must be considered, which far exceeds the written word. I'm of the opinion that many very problematic photographs are still used in connection with the genocide of Sinti and Roma. The supposed knowledge that is presented about so-called gypsies is condensed in these photographs. They often follow a genre that has contributed to the dehumanization and racialization of the minority, and that is a genre that really, we know it for now centuries in Europe, starting with the paintings, the postcards, and then the photographs. I think that dealing with this particular photograph can illustrate very well how the encyclopedia creates a network of knowledge that provides the context necessary to understand this photograph. Each photo is accompanied by a detailed caption. It describes what can be seen in the photo, when it was taken, and if possible, by whom, as well as to what historical moment it relates to. If possible, we also try to identify the persons on the photograph. Here you see that we know that here we have Roma from Burgenland in Dachau concentration camp in July 1938, and because of the numbers on the trousers, it was able to identify Stefan Hotosi, second from right, and Ignaz Horvath, right, and where they came from St. Margareten. And there were 232 Roma from Burgenland at that time that were sent to the concentration camp. And we also know who took the photograph. And then when it, we describe the context, and from here it is also linked to dilemmas in the encyclopedia. The aftermath is dealt with in almost every lemma. Whether it is the biographies or the crime scenes, the perpetrators or the countries that are written about, there's an aftermath everywhere that continues to this day. The chronology, therefore, continues beyond 1945, about Nazi trials, compensation, or the cancellation of degrees dating back to the war years, for example, regarding internment in camps in France or banishment in Italy in 1946. It was only in 1946 when these measures were abandoned. What can already be recognized is the long duration of the struggle for recognition and remembrance. This includes the history of the civil rights movements after 1945, as well as the belated placement of memorial plaques or memorial stones in public spaces. It also includes the extremely late erection of appropriate memorials, such as the Central Memorial to the Genocide shown here, which was inaugurated in Berlin only in 2012. And it also includes the fact that it took 80 years after the last remaining Sinti and Roma were murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau for a memorial to be open to the public in Lety. Coming to my end. We are all trying to collect the scattered knowledge. We are running late. But we have learned to search to find facts, to research biographies. We can find the places where the crimes happened. Sometimes we can even process them and thus bring them back into public discourse. We build networks to exchange information. And yet there is still much that remains unexplored, such as the question of the victim's property, like the question of collaboration, like the question of responsibilities. And there are still empty spaces that will never be filled. We also have to deal with absence, with loss. Perhaps art can visualize this better than historians can. That's why I'm showing this object at the end of my lecture. It was made for an exhibition I created 2020 at the City of Cologne's Documentation Center on National Socialism. The artist was Ulrike Oether. She created this object after a violin belonging to the Sintoo musician Markus Reinhardt. It was an object to illustrate that round about 1,000 Sinti and Roma musicians from Germany alone have been murdered during the genocide. And thousands of instruments have been stolen. How can we represent this where we know so little about? Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Ja ďakujem za túto výbornú prezentáciu. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. And I believe we did save ourselves about 10 minutes for a question or two. If I believe there must be many after this, so please. Oh, if nobody's brave enough, then I have more of a note than a question, perhaps. In the museum's collections, we have some papers from the estate of Vlasta Kladivová that include lists of transports of Roma and Sinti from Auschwitz to other camps. Yes. I imagine Michal Schuster might have told you. So, have you seen this?
Yes, of course. Well. I'm sometimes forced to speak very generally. Of course, the research here from the Czech lands and the lists and the dates, they are perfect. Really. We have good information here from the historians and, of course, from your museum. But, for example, there are a lot of transports between the concentration camps of Sinti and Roma. We have no exact numbers and dates about the men that had been deported in 1938. There was a lot of, after the dissolution of the camp area in Auschwitz-Birkenau in spring 44 and then in August 44, a lot of prisoners from Auschwitz had been deported to other camps, namely to Ravensbrück and then to Buchenwald. And how these transport took place, how many they were, there are different numbers. And then you have the Hungarian Roma that had been deported from Komarom. How many exactly? When exactly? Where did they go? A lot of them were brought to Dachau, we know, and from Dachau to Buchenwald some, others to Ravensbrück. A lot of Sinti and Roma ended up in Bergen-Belsen. When? How many? There are a few transports. So this is one thing. The other thing is when it comes to Auschwitz. Of course, we are always focused on the camp section B2E, where from end of February 1943, the deportations began and which the lager was so-called liquidated, beginning of August 44. But there were not only a handful of Roma in Auschwitz I before that date, before February 1943. Some hundred, for example, were deported from the Polish Roma from the Transcarpathian region to Auschwitz. They were in the so-called Stammlager. We never talk about them. And then there are stories of Sinti and Roma who had been in camp B2E, who had then been deported. Mainly we know this about a lot of women who had been then deported in spring 44 to Ravensbrück. And then from Ravensbrück, they came to a satellite camp of Buchenwald, and in October 1944, they were back in Auschwitz. We never talk about them. Of course, there were still Roma and Sinti in Auschwitz after August 1944. Don't talk about them because we do not know a lot about them. Yeah, okay, please.
Thank you for all the information you gave us here today. It's a very important information. And I have one question, one unanswered question. You also mentioned Hungary. And many people know the work of Raoul Wallenberg. He was giving out passports to Jewish people, and they could go to Sweden. And my question is, did the Roma came to the Swedish consul to get a passport or not? There is no information about that. It was only Jewish people who came to the consul.
I only don't know this. I don't know this. Well, I have colleagues from Sweden who contribute for the encyclopedia, but this information is not known. And I think there are a lot of things where people could go into the archives and find out more. Of course, one has to go into the archives to find it out. What we know when it comes to the ambassadors, for example, I quoted in the beginning some single examples about a report from 1940 that the ambassador reported to Switzerland about the deportation of Sinti in May 1940. Of course, nothing happened. But, I think if we would go into archives, we would find out a lot more. And the question, what did the international public know about the murder of Sinti and Roma? I think it's an important question. Because it also shows that there was knowledge, but they did not really take it into consideration for measures after the war. Of course, we know there had been trials where also the crimes committed against Sinti and Roma had been taken into account, but there was not such a prominent trial where this played a crucial role. And on the other hand, for example, when it comes to Westerbork, from where also these deportations took place in 1944 to Auschwitz, we know that there a consul from, I think it was Ecuador or Italy and Guatemala, they saved some people, giving them passports, and they were not deported. But for example, there were also some Swiss Sinti in this transport. They were not saved. The consul didn't do anything. They just, refer to, it's not proof that you are really a Swiss citizen, although they were born in a Swiss country. So I think how these ambassadors, consuls behaved, we have to have a closer look on that, yes.
Tak ja ďakujem za otázky aj za prednášku znova a pozývam vás na prvú dnešnú prestávku. Občerstvenie nájdete vonku vo foaje a uvidíme sa tu o 11. hodine znova. Ďakujem.